Hello and welcome to the Michael Mamas Show. I'm your host, Michael Mamas, and we're coming to you from a rainy Mount Soma, home of the Sri Someshwara Temple in the mountains of western North Carolina. And today, this is like a major concept we're going to cover today. But I think it's important, and I wasn't even going to bring this up. It comes to mind, the whole thing with the abortion issue and Roe versus Wade and all that and everything that's going on. Scotty, you had something you wanted to say about that?
Oh yeah, because I'm wondering what that really says. Because we were with a group of people, and everybody started freaking out right away. Hey, we're taking away rights from women and all that. And then the other people were saying, well, no, if you really paid attention, uh, it's just giving the choice to the states. The people that live in the states are going to vote on what happens, and that'll be that. So,
Yeah, and that's
that
a
was one
fact.
side of it.
Yeah, I mean, it is a fact that it just turning it over to states, and the Supreme Court legally never really had the right to make that decision in the first place. At the same time, I can understand serious concern about what the state's going to come up with. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So it throws a really important issue kind of up in
Right.
the air, at least until we find out how the states all, feel about it.
Yeah, because that's the next question that I had for them is like, okay, if they voted in, when because now there's all sorts of questions about not just it can you get an abortion, but now when is the abortion when is it okay to do it?
Yeah.
Like to in
So
the
of course,
term,
yeah, that's right.
you know,
That's right.
and,
And then
and so this is a multivariable.
somebody else was bringing up the fact that regardless of what the states do, you can mail order a pill that induces abortion at the early stages. And people would just do that. I don't know. The whole thing it's a very difficult subject. Uh, with respect to the law itself, I'm a strong advocate of states' rights. I think it makes sense for the federal government not to be taking over all these different things that they're not supposed to, education and so on. But of course, then that brings up civil war. And if we stuck too firmly to states' rights, does that mean that, slavery would be legal in some states? That can't be okay. Anyway, it gets complicated, you know.
Yeah, that would create a problem.
Yeah, that'd be horrible.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, what we're going to talk about today is prapancham. Now, uh, in the Vedic tradition, there's one universe, and it's a huge universe, and it contains all the different universes that physicists are theorizing about multiple universes. But they don't, in the Vedic, they don't call them universes plural. They call them prapancham, and there are multiple prapancham. But the word prapancham is a really important one because it's true not just respect with the cosmos, but also with respect, it exists on different levels. Like everything in Sanskrit everything does exist what we call transgradatingly on different levels. And so the idea is that with respect to the individual, we each have our own prapancham. We each have our own world. And that's what we live in. That's how this whole environment we're living in is calculated, is understood, is interfaced with. And then the idea of parallel, what we call universes, but parallel prapancham is that we all share this one greater prapancham called, what we would call our universe, but we share it, but each of our experiences of it are unique. Your prapancham is unique, my prapancham is unique, everybody's living in a unique prapancham, but they so closely parallel that we interface through them. And I think if we, we can work with that just as our own personal, in a very practical way in our lives uh, for a long time, because it's difficult really to get that, what we mean by a word or how we see things is just organically, physiologically, based on the physiology, if you will, of our prapancham. It's different than the person sitting next to you. And so there becomes a real art, a real finesse into how to manage, if that word is okay, our relationship with all the different prapancham, because also different groups, they kind of have a world of their prapanchams, if you will, that interface in a particular way. In other words, it's a group dynamic, a way that particular group thinks, and it's a little different than the way this particular group thinks. And so you can look at prapancham in that sense, in the sense of group consciousnesses. And then the world, it's another global consciousness, global prapancham, and the art. I'll tell you, I was around a great teacher in India, and his ability to stay clear with that just spontaneously. He didn't have to think about it. Just, you feel it. I mean, there different parts of the world. You could say Americans versus, I don't know, Europeans or whatever. There's a little different nature in their prapanchams there, and how to manage them, how to even assist the evolution of one particular group of people based on the nature of their prapancham, and how it's different than how you manage the evolution of another group. And it also goes for individuals. It's not a whitewashing. It's not all the same for everybody. We're all unique. So we do well then to try to gain some understanding of the nature of our prapancham as an individual, and also the prapancham of other people. But that's a very subtle thing, and there are just different ways of approaching it. And any of those ways, they're like models, and if you cling on to the model too ardently, then it becomes a labeling and a compromising of the person's psychology, psychodynamic structure. But nevertheless, if it's managed well, it helps us. And there's one model in particular, it's talked about in the Veda, it talks about the 5 divine currents. And you see so what is it that forms our individual prapancham? We do well to explore that. And the way that works I could say a physiological sense, is when the soul enters the body, and that's of course happening in the birthing process. And so the soul comes in through the crown, and then it starts to occupy, incarnate, starts to occupy the physiology and so we're not fully incarnated, you could say, until the soul is rooted in the root chakra, in the first chakra, the area of the sacrum. That's why they call it the sacred bone, because the whole process of spiritual growth and growth as an individual, evolution of an individual, has to do with interfacing the spiritual nature, the divine nature, the wisdom component of our being with the physiology on all levels. And it comes in that way. It comes in through the heart, through the gut, and finally roots in the pelvis, And so that physiological process, psychologists tell us, in fact, that it's like the first 5 years of individual's life go a long way into determining the nature, the structure of a person's prapancham, of a person's persona, their psychology, what makes them tick. And so all these different qualities that come in, they deal with different divine currents, aspects of our divinity, but there's karma can get created around each of those different 5 divine currents. And that is largely a function of when the incarnation process, particularly in those first 5 years, gets interrupted, if we could say, or gets interfered with. And so the first one is right when the soul first starts entering the body. And that usually happens like in the, actually before birth, during pregnancy. The soul starts to enter through the crown. And then also that continues like during the birthing process itself. So if it was a difficult birth, or if there was something not right in utero, those can create karma, traumas in the psyche that get carried with the person through the rest of their life.
Michael,
And, yeah.
Can it be predisposed to lean in certain directions for certain, I don't know, I want to say distortions,
Yeah.
certain, you know what I mean?
Right. And it's a good question, because you see, when the soul gets interrupted in the birthing process, if you will, in the incarnation process, that is largely a function of whatever karma that soul brought in with it. And so it's a little bit like, did the birthing process cause the trauma, or was it karma that determined that the birthing process would go that way? And, you could say both are true. So yeah, it's karma that you brought in with you, and that determines the whole thing. So it's a good point, Scotty, but at any rate, then that type of trauma in the early incarnation process, in utero or during the birthing process, that creates a thing where the soul doesn't want to enter the body. It's like, man, it's dangerous there. Things aren't good. I'm staying out here. And so what happens then is people, and you'll see people like that, where they just seem that they're out in the clouds, expressions like that. And it's kind of like they're floating. They're not really in their body. But because of that, the body's not fully energized. And so it becomes like thin and emaciated, and their left-right imbalances, and they don't really have much of an intimate connection, you could say, with physicality at all. In fact, they sort of feel like they're spiritual beings and they're above it all, and you'll see them, thin body. You can kind of identify somebody who has that sort of karma going on. But then after that, after they incarnate, there can be the next thing. So we're coming from the crown and we go into the throat and the heart. And so that, and there becomes then a connection with mother, with receiving, giving nourishment, that whole kind of a thing, that exchange, breastfeeding stage, all that. And that creates a kind of a wanting, and that creates a dynamic where they're not feeling fed. Nothing feeds them. Nobody can feed them. Nobody can love them just right. And if I have to ask for love, it's not really love. And if I don't ask for love, I won't get it. And so, there's double binds to all these things. And then it goes in further. And the next thing is into like into the third chakra area. And it deals with interaction with mother, father, and then how that maps out into the rest of the world. And so and there's a confusion there, because there's a love, of course, there, but also if there's karma around it, it can feel invasive. And so the body can get big in older life, just to build up and protect, and big fat body, Oliver Hardy type thing, John Candy type thing, very loving, but nevertheless this issue with invasion, which can elicit rage. And then it goes on like that. It goes into the next step in the birthing process, incarnation process, has to do with maybe around age 4 or so. And that's when all of a sudden this dynamic of child with parents is like, something's not right. And here I believed in them and relied on them, and then I'm starting to see that they've got their problems and the world isn't the way they presented it. And so it becomes a betrayal kind of a feeling. And so that creates people who are committed to their own cause and their own beliefs. And so there's that whole dynamic. And then going even further, all the way into the root chakra, where if it gets interrupted there, the final stage around age 5, what's going on there? Well, then it's interesting because that which goes on below the waist and that which we associate with, up in the head and above, they're very different, and you get into issues with, going to the bathroom or sexual encounters, sexual relationship, those more earthy, if you will, type of functions versus the lofty spiritual, world of divinity and spirituality, and everything's lovely. And so if things get interrupted in that stage, and that awareness around that usually occurs, around age 5, then you've got somebody who's, heart and spirituality isn't really very well connected to their sexuality and the messiness of the earth plane, So that's and so what all these things do then is they form a dynamic, very profound, strong influence, depending on the nature of the karma, a very strong influence into the nature of an individual's prapancham, their world. And their world has to do with how they view everything around them, how they interact with everything around them. And so that's, I like to say then that it's not so much, certainly what happens is important, but what's probably even more important in most cases is your relationship with what happened in your childhood, in your life. That's why, 5 kids can all have the same parents and they all have very different characterological natures, because their relationship based on these early years of life and how it got developed in them as individuals determines their relationship with the environment, relationship with what happened. And so relationship with becomes a very huge part of it. And here we're sharing the same earth plane, but we're all living in our own prapancham. And they're very, very different. And it's very difficult to ascertain then how another person thinks. And that's where we get into this notion of projective identification. Well, if that happened to me, this is how I feel, therefore that's how you feel. And that's, of course, bogus, but it's extremely common. It's even hard to get around,
It's funny, Michael, we used to have a thing when we were working with Marriott and the salespeople. They talked about the golden rule: do unto others as as you would do unto them, or whatever. You
would have them do unto you.
Yeah. But we always talked about the platinum rule, which was do unto others as they would have done unto themselves. So it made the salespeople more effective, because they actually, we're telling them to try to see the world through their eyes,
to understand,
to present what we were doing,
Yeah, to really understand another person is not so easy to do,
No.
and to try to get them to think the way you think is largely futile,
Yeah.
So then the art of working with other prapanchams, be they of an individual or of a group or what have you, it's a very subtle and sublime finesse,
Right.
And that teacher I was around in India, he was so masterful at that. It was like he could really get the sense of the nature of a prapancham, be it of an individual or a group of people, and relate to that group, if you will, in a way that was unique to how he'd relate to that group. And it was all about not what they necessarily even always wanted, but what they needed to evolve, It's a very, very interesting thing. And then there's the whole idea of, where's our freedom with respect to that? Is it all just karmic? Well, I teach largely Westerners, and when I teach Westerners, I tell them you have a lot less free will than you think you have. A lot of it is karmic. I have a friend from Delhi who teaches in India, and he tells his students that you have a lot more free will than you think you do. So again, it's our nature of our relationship with the notion of freedom. And just because we feel free doesn't mean we are free. It could be our karmic predetermination that makes us think we're free when we're really not, you know? And so this whole idea of how do we become free? Because that's what spiritual liberation is all about. You might still have your history and the five divine current karmas going on, but you have enough of the inner divinity within you, not just from la la land, you know, but from the depth of your being, uh, uh, rooted in the depth of your physiology and the depth of your soul. Then you see, uh, and as that gets enlivened and stronger, then you are in the world, but not of it. You see, and that's the evolutionary process, you know. So there's this whole dynamic between free will and predetermination, really, because karmic is pretty much predetermined. You see, and so how do we cultivate our free will? All too often, the way people try to cultivate their free will is to impose another conditioning or another sort of karmic dynamic on it. Well, I'm not a human doing. I'm a human being. Well, that's just a thought, you know. And there's truth to it, but really that's the I get it syndrome. Because how do you really rest in your own being as opposed to clinging to another notion? And so that's why meditation is the most powerful form of uh, uh, becoming free. And why do we want real free will? Because that's when our will aligns with the transcendental depth of our being, that source of infinite wisdom, intelligence, that dwells at the depth that birthed the whole universe. And what is that? Well, people would call that God. So your will aligns with God's will. But, you know, that can kind of sound like, well, does that mean now I'm just obeying God's will, like I'm some subordinate being? And that's, I mean, I hear that, but that's not really exactly what it means. It means you are functioning from that place of your own inner divinity, which is in harmony with God's divinity, you know? And so that gets to the thing where even if you have fully enlightened people, they're going to disagree based on their own nature of their own unique interface with God, with divinity. So God's will is a lot bigger than just one little rule that applies to everybody or one perspective that applies to everything. It's bigger. It's much bigger than that. So we meditate, we fully enliven, more and more enliven our own divinity. That gives the tail of the kite of our being, it gives the kite of our being a bigger tail. So we stop spinning around our karma and we become grounded and we soar higher with our own true nature. Meditation, and then also what we're doing here at Mount Soma, building a unified field generator, something that enlivens that transcendental depth within the whole environment, permeates the whole environment. And that's today's podcast. Unless I left anything out, Scotty.
No, I think we covered it.
All right, that'll do it. Everybody, thanks for listening, and we'll be back on again next week. Take care.